This is the ERP Advisor.
Today's episode, how to approach ERP user training and adoption.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for today's webinar, How to Approach ERP User Training and Adoption. Shelby Toney is our, did I pronounce that right?
Toney, actually.
Toney. I want to get all fancy. It's like Tarjay. Is our EAG speaker for today. As a consulting manager, Shelby guides our clients through successful ERP implementations, helping to report on project risks, develop change management plans, and all other tasks the client resources do not have the capacity to complete. Her 4 years of implementation experience at PwC and additional in-house software implementation experience prior to joining the EAG team have made her an invaluable source both for our clients and as an internal leader at EAG. On today's call, we will break down the key factors to consider when approaching ERP user training and outline EAG's top tips for successfully training your users during an ERP implementation. Thank you for joining me, Shelby.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Sorry, I tried to make your last name
It's okay. It's fun.
into French. But yeah, this is your second time joining us on the ERP Advisor.
Yes.
You are really an invaluable implementation resource for us and know so many things, have worked with so many clients. So I'm really excited for you to be here, step into Sean's role and share some of that expertise with us today.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you.
I'm sure you also have clients on the call who want to see how you're doing. So we'll just kick this off just to clarify and set the groundwork. What is user training and why is it important to the success of an ERP implementation?
Yeah, absolutely. So user training is really making sure that all of the end users of the system, of the ERP or the other, integration systems we're implementing know how to actually use the system. We want to make sure that come day one, come go live, they are able to execute their day-to-day business processes in the new system. Training is important because we can do all of the data migration that's needed, make sure we have all of our data in the system. We can set up the configuration to be exactly the way that the business needs it to be, kind of ensure that all the settings are there, all the users have access. And then if they don't actually know how to do their business process come day one, we're not actually able to go live. We're not able to kind of click the buttons and fulfill the orders and, enter the invoices and kind of do all the work that's actually needed in the system.
Yeah, definitely. And we're going to dive into a lot deeper into some of the reasons why these fail. But I know when you and I were talking about it, it's not even just about like, when do I click this button or when do I enter this data? It's also about like, wow, when am I using this system?
Yeah.
When am I leaving the ERP to go perform another task? And so I think so much more in training than I think people even realize.
Yeah, exactly. It's that understanding of, well, when am I going to be using the ERP in my business process? Yes, of course, our systems are important and we're using them every single day, but there's other times where you have to make a phone call or you have to, go talk to your peer or send an email. And when are you going in the system and executing the tasks in the ERP versus maybe the other systems that you have? So yeah, very, very important to have all of that super clear at the beginning.
Really. And already that does set the foundation for what we're going to be talking about today. And I think it's important. I'm sure so many people sign up for this call because user training is often overlooked and it often falls short. And people don't realize just how much that can impact the success of your ERP implementation overall. So, what are some of the common pitfalls that result in failed user training? And how can companies keep themselves from making the same mistakes?
Yeah, I think that when we talk about common pitfalls, the first one that comes to mind for me is really just not planning ahead and not actually preparing for the training itself. So our end user training is typically happening towards the very end of an implementation, closer to when we go live. So it's fresh in the mind of our end users right before they're expected to use the system. And so that process can typically just kind of get left behind in our planning because we're super focused on all those things I was saying before about our data migration, our configuration. Once the configuration's done, we start testing. And then we're like, oh yeah, we have to, train our additional end users right before the end. And so really just making sure that we're planning ahead for that is the biggest thing. And part of that is understanding what style of training is going to be done. So oftentimes our vendors or implementation partners are implementing a train the trainer approach. And so when doing that, we need to align early on the expectations of the trainers in that train the trainer approach. So if the trainers are expected to learn the system in walkthroughs or in the first round of training that's for that core team, for our subject matter experts, then we need to make sure they go into those walkthroughs or those training sessions knowing that they have to lead the training for the end users towards the end of the implementation. So they can be prepared for that. So they can be thinking with the lens of how am I going to train my team with this? And do I understand this well enough to pass this along to the users? And then start thinking about documentation too, which, and back to your question on other pitfalls, is just really thinking about what type of training material and training method we want to use for the implementation. So really thinking about, do we want to have user guides? Do we want to have end-to-end process, walkthrough documentation? Do we want to have SOPs? Or do we want to do in-person training in the room? With have our SMEs kind of walk our end users through training? Do we want to create videos? And so really just that's another piece of the planning that we really want to make sure we're thinking about ahead of time.
Definitely. And you used a couple acronyms there. So I'd love for you to define those just for anybody on the call who may not have heard.
Yeah, absolutely. So SOPs, standard operating processes. So oftentimes that kind of documentation that we're creating there was one of them. What were the other acronyms I used?
SMEs, which most people should know.
Our subject matter experts. Yes, of course.
Yeah, just as sometimes people come to us and they have never done this before. So usually trying to define some of those acronyms is helpful.
Yeah.
But I know talking about some of the things you were talking about, like identifying the SMEs who are going to be part of that training program, how do you figure out who is going to be doing that? Is it all your SMEs in the project? Are there certain ones that you guys determine are going to be helping with training? Like, what does that process look like?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it's really about laying out the core project team roles and responsibilities at the beginning of the project. We don't have to fully align on the training plan and the trainers at the beginning of the project, but it's thinking about who is going to own these different process areas. So as we come out of our walkthroughs and start to move into typically the next step is our user acceptance testing. We are really looking for a bit of a transition point where the process owners are taking on full ownership of their process area. So they're making sure it's getting tested. They're making sure it fits the business need. If it doesn't, they need to be raising their hand and asking for changes or asking for more sessions to walk through the process. So really making sure that our process area owners know that they have ownership of their area, and that also will kind of feed into the training piece. So are they the ones that are going to be training? Do they have critical team members that are also involved as subject matter experts? Maybe one step below, kind of we have our overall process area owner and then our individual process area owners. And so really just defining who's going to own each process area and who makes the most sense to either be the trainer or create the documentation. And like I was saying, making sure that they know going into even the earlier sessions of the project what the expectation of them is, so that say we go into walkthroughs, maybe they can be taking their notes a certain way, or they can be asking certain questions that they're thinking with that lens of, oh, I'm going to be creating a training document, or I'm going to be leading a training session soon.
Right. And you mentioned something super interesting, which I had never really considered as someone from the outside looking in, is utilizing tools that you already have at your disposal and how your employees are currently using those. Can you touch on just the benefit of that and what you've seen success?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm thinking of one specific client example where they had a learning management system, an LMS system, and they already had some other kind of training material and videos and documentation that the users were used to looking at and accessing and using when they had questions just in their normal day-to-day, let alone an implementation of a new system. And so we really leveraged those tools that the client was already using to okay, let's go ahead and create documentation and put that in here. Let's create videos in the same way and add those in here.
Mhm.
And so we created a lot of videos and the same way that the client was used to seeing them. So it's really just thinking about how do your people work and what are they used to currently using and how can we kind of go ahead and leverage some of those tools if they're used to accessing a certain document storage location, if they're used to, if they do have an LMS, like let's go ahead and use those in the implementation too.
Yeah, definitely. And it's really setting your people up for success with what you already have
Yeah,
instead of we're not
exactly.
trying to reinvent the wheel. And I think you go into most projects not wanting to reinvent the
Yes.
wheel, but trying to make sure that they can be the best that they can be.
Yeah,
So,
we're already trying to implement a new ERP. Let's not also implement a new training process if
yeah,
we do have one that's been proven to be successful.
definitely. And that actually leads really well into our next question, which is training never looks the same for two organizations. Everybody has their own processes already in place. They have unique people. What factors can impact training across organizations, industries, solutions, any of those kind of things? And do you have any examples of clients we've been able to help overcome those challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think for this one, the biggest thing is just seeing training and the planning of training as a change management
Mhm.
exercise. So we need to figure out what the best fit is for your business. And that's what we go into training as we're advising all of our clients to understand what the best fit is for them. So there's not going to just be a, one size fits all for
Right.
training coming in and the EAG way is to do in person or to do videos. It's let's understand what your people need, what works for your people, and put that process into place. So it's thinking about do we know if, for example, another client example here is when we had a client that we knew that everyone was kind of joining these video calls and not going on camera, not asking questions, and we asked around with the client team a little bit and understood that maybe they weren't actually engaged and they were working on other things on the side. So for them, it didn't make sense to do a video call for training, and we said, hey, let's get everyone in the room together and actually have a training lead in the room walking them through, have everyone on their computers stepping through themselves step by step, and that was a
Mhm.
much better fit for them. Whereas some clients don't necessarily need that in-person style, and it makes more sense to say, hey, you guys are already super busy. You're also very dedicated to this project, and you know that training needs to happen to, you
Mhm.
know, be able to move forward. And so we handed off documentation to those folks and said, hey, we need you to go kind of review this and step through it and bring us any questions or issues or additional support that you need. So really just kind of thinking through what works for the business, and that's going to look different for every team, not necessarily every person, but really just understanding the team and how the people within the team are best going to receive the information.
Absolutely. And from a product perspective, I know that I look across products every week, every day, and I see that there's some key differences. How does the product the client selects impact their training?
Yeah, I think for this, it's really goes back to what we were talking about with using the tools that we already have. So let's talk to our vendor, our partner. Let's look at what the offerings are within the system itself and see if we can use that as a baseline for our documentation or for the training that we are going to walk through. So, some systems do have built-in training guides already, or some systems have a full training portal that a lot of our clients are opting in as they're signing their contract to select that as well. And so we'll kind of hand off some general navigation training at the beginning of the project and assign them a few courses within that system. And then at the end, we'll towards the user training at the end of the project, we'll hand off more training to them through that system. So it's really looking at what the offerings are of this system, and if we, of course, we may want to create some client specific user guides or documentation, but rather than starting with a blank Word document, let's go ahead into the system and see what they have that we can clientize and make specific to your business.
Absolutely. And this one was super interesting when you and I were talking and preparing for this call before, is when you start to get into those industry differences and
Yes.
how they can impact what the training looks like and how people are interacting with the system. I would love to hear a little bit more about some of those examples that you've seen and kind of
Yeah.
dive into how we've been able to help those clients overcome those hurdles.
Yeah, absolutely. So This one is really interesting because it's still a people exercise of what works best for the people, for the teams, but it's thinking about, well, what are they actually doing in their day to day? If they're not, sitting at a desk, sitting behind a computer, we may not want to evaluate it with the same lens of, do we want to send them a document or do we want to put them in a room? But we may want to think about how can we just add tools for them in what they're already doing. So one example that's, comes super clearly to my mind is just the folks for our manufacturing clients who are on the shop floor. So for them, they are, they may need to understand how to step through the processes while they're actively standing at a piece of machinery.
Right.
And so for them, a really successful thing has been to set up kind of user guides or job guides. We would, typically call them at the job,
Right.
And make those very simple so that they are able to look at, okay, here's step 1 through 7 while I'm standing at this piece of machinery and entering into the iPad or whatever it is that the ERP or other systems connected to. And so, of course, we want to still give them more background and a training session before we, kind of put them out on the floor, but then adding in that supplemental job guide as well was really successful for them. And it's really similar to like some field services teams within clients that we've helped support where they are having to, work with handhelds, and that's a much different process. So we've looked at options for, doing that virtual training where we can pull up the handheld on a screen, on a computer screen and share that through, and they can look at the handheld in their hand. But sometimes it's better to just, even if they're, across the country or the region, to bring them all into a room and physically show them with the handheld how they will press the buttons. So just really thinking with that, thinking with that lens of what are our people going to be doing if they're not just kind of sitting behind a computer and using the system that way, and giving them tools that they can use on a daily basis at the beginning of the implementation.
Right. And that's a super interesting example for sure, the field services side of things.
Yeah.
And we actually, funny enough, had a field service company that was training for their new system next door. So we saw them all here. They brought everybody in person. All the trucks were here.
Yeah.
And how do you go about ensuring that they're actually utilizing it correctly, out in the field? Because I know there's not always a one-for-one translation where when you're training in a room, if we're sitting here and you're telling me how to use the system and I'm using it in the iPad, how do you guys track the success of that training once they're actually in the field?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really about going back to what I was saying about our process area owners, giving them that kind of responsibility and that role of ownership of what do these folks actually need to be doing when they're out in the field, and how can we validate that in the system. So going into the system and literally checking what they're entering, if it's a report or whatever they're entering in the system, having our process area owners go in and validate that at the beginning. And also, as part of our training, that's where it's I mentioned before, having users clicking through the system alongside the trainers. That's an area where it's really important to actually have them practice before, so that we can kind of look over their shoulder, look over their screen and say, oh no, you need to be, selecting this field before you click enter, or, oh, you need to make sure that you do it this way, or, oh, that doesn't actually fit the process, this example that you're using, you're supposed to be using this kind of use case instead for the way that you're entering this. So I think it's really a lot of practice ahead of time, hands-on experience, so that we feel like they have the tools to go out. And then that kind of measurement of success is really on those owners of the process area to give them the right support that they need, validate their work if they maybe won't reach out for that support too.
Wouldn't it be great if there was somebody out there who was truly independent, truly objective, and who really cared about what you needed? That's ERP Advisors Group. That is exactly what we do. We have a proven methodology that'll take you through the needs analysis, selection, implementation, and even optimization, where you'll go from being confused and upset and scared and unsure all the way through to having successful software that does exactly what you need it to do. We'd like to offer you a free consultation. Click on the button down below and let's spend a few minutes, even 10, 15 minutes, and talk about your project. And I bet you'll be surprised. There'll be some things we can do for you, even over that call, that would help you, much less talk about how we could work with you over the duration of your project. And just know you don't have to do this project alone. You don't have to face these confusions on your own. It's exactly what ERP Advisors Group is here for, and we look forward to helping you through your process.
Yeah, it's not as simple as sending you out onto the job site with every single one of them, right?
Yeah.
And having you make sure that they're clicking all the right
Exactly.
buttons.
I mean, ideally, maybe, but
We would need like 50 Shelbys at that point,
exactly.
which is not realistic.
Exactly.
And interesting, there was another client that I wanted to talk about in this section that I don't believe you were on the project, but they had a very unique user base. And so the training documents themselves were completely different than anything that we'd really worked on before. Um, and kind of determining how have we helped clients in the past evaluate what their users needed in order to make the training documents more specific to their needs.
Yeah, absolutely. So I touched on a little bit this being a change management exercise, but this goes back to the very beginning of the project when we do start the change management planning and we are evaluating our stakeholder list. So who is going to be involved in this project as a subject matter expert, as an end user, and then, once we have that list, then okay, who are our individual, stakeholder groups? Who are other impacted parties other than just the users? And then what are the kind of change management situations or risks that we're seeing, and how are we going to mitigate that? So the way that we're able to lay out, we need to see this training documentation in this way is by starting that exercise of who are our impacted groups, what are those things that we see as unique or needing attention or needing more focus, and then how are we addressing it? And a lot of those things end up from the change management planning end up being communications or special kind of reach outs or incentives or training. So that's a really big output of our change management planning is just identifying the right approach to training. Right. So that's really where we would have identified that, okay, this group needs additional attention. They're going to not need, or they're not going to kind of be able to view documentation in the same way or just have that kind of access to documentation in the same way. And so we really want to make that specialized for them. And that's really the process, like I was saying, kind of from the beginning of starting to identify that.
Yeah, for anyone listening, like that project, very interesting because they had people who needed some special accommodations, like blind users, people who maybe weren't going to, like you said, interact with the system in the same way that other people were going to, that needed these special accommodations to ensure that they were doing their job properly. So that one was I know that was a really cool project and one of the many cool projects that we've been able to work on and support our clients.
Yeah.
And just kind of going into the last question, we're making great time today on this topic that is a little painful to talk about sometimes. What best practices do EAG's implementation consultants bring to user training? And how can companies apply those best practices within their own ERP implementations? Really a summary of all the things we talked about today that you would like viewers to walk away from.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the first piece, which is really the first piece of what we talked about, is just preparing early. So making sure that, we are able to step in and support our clients in what is your training going to look like? Let's start identifying your user groups. Let's start identifying your training plan early in the project, which is not something that is often talked about early enough in the project. And so that's something that, we support our clients in. That's something that, you all can be thinking about as you're going into these implementations. I think another thing is just identifying the right approach. So we talked a lot about do we want it to be a video? Do we want it to be documentation? How are we going to actually deliver this? And so understanding that fit of what do the individual users need and how are we going to approach training, I think is another one that we really help our clients dig into and kind of understand. And that feeds into the piece of documentation too. So just thinking about what type of documentation are we going to provide, and we help our clients develop that documentation or give them the tools to be able to develop it themselves, to, pass that off to the process area owners, like I was saying, and, really giving them the ownership of their area. And then I think too, just the expectations for our trainers for whatever the approach is that we lay out, we really want to make sure that that's being planned for earlier in the project. So kind of going back to that planning piece, but more specifically thinking about the expectations that we have of our trainers, the expectations of what we need to get out of our walkthroughs or get out of our testing or get out of this specific meeting for our trainers to be prepared, is really something that you want to be talking about before you go into those meetings or before you go into those sessions. So I think that's really critical. And then really just the other, biggest and one of the, I think the most valuable things that we are able to bring to projects is just advising based on past approaches. So we're able to see all the things we just talked about and so many more projects, like taking all of those different approaches and how they fit, going into a new project and working with a new client. We're never going to know from the start, we're not going to know that, oh yeah, this is the one size fits all, like I said, for training. But as we get to know the client, we can lean on all of those past approaches and really help them define what works for them.
Yeah. And for any of these calls, I like to constantly remind people who are attending and listening to us that no one has ever implemented your system in your instance with your people at this time under these business conditions. So every single time you undergo a project, even if you have undergone one with your company 20 years ago, it's going to look completely different than what you did now. And so I think you guys also, something that you didn't touch on that I think is super valuable is just that alignment across all parties.
Yeah, absolutely.
Your team, everybody here from selection all the way through implementation and post go live optimization support, like alignment is so huge on user training and making sure, like you said, the expectations that are set for the trainers, but also ensuring that the vendor knows how to communicate those standards to them. That everything is set up so that they're not going into a call blindly.
Yeah.
And you actually had a great example of that with a client who didn't realize or like was not made aware that walkthroughs were the training.
Yeah.
And the vendor didn't necessarily communicate that either. So we were able to step in and really say like, okay, this was supposed to be the training session. We didn't get out of it what we needed. And then you also advocated for the client to have another training session. So
exactly.
That alignment and that advocacy is so important in what you guys do. And that's just my own little plug, my own little shout out to your team and anybody who's on this call who really is in need of advice from somebody who can guide them through that process. So
yeah, absolutely.
wonderful. We kept this short and sweet today. Thank you so much for joining us, and thank you everyone on the call for joining us. A very special thank you to Shelby. We always appreciate you showing up and sharing your knowledge from a very different perspective than anybody else has, deep in the trenches of these implementations. And please let me know, anybody on the call, if you have any questions that we can answer. Definitely reach out, message us either in the Zoom or through email, Rebecca.McCabe at erpadvisorsgroup.com, or on our website, and someone from my team will be able to answer your questions. Be sure to join us for our next webinar, which is actually scheduled for Thursday, March 26th, Achieving True ROI on Your Enterprise Software Investments, where Sean Windle will be back to teach businesses how to accurately predict ROI for software investments and actually achieve those results through proper expectation and resource management. This is a free CPE and a very important topic that lots of companies are dealing with, so I highly encourage you to check it out. You can go to our website, ERPadvisorsgroup.com, for more details, learning objectives, and to register. ERP Advisors Group is one of the country's top independent enterprise software advisory firms. EAG advises mid to large-sized businesses on selecting and implementing business applications from enterprise resource planning, customer relationship management, human capital management, business intelligence, and other enterprise applications, which equate to millions of dollars in software deals each year across many industries. This has been the ERP Advisor. Thank you again for joining us.